Hi, Doug Guthrie here. Hope you're all doing well. Um, as you all know, I'm Doug Guthrie, the a professor of global leadership at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, and also the co-founder and chairman of On Global Leadership. Our goal with On Global Leadership is to help people understand what's going on in China, and help people understand how important the issues of U.S.-China relations and China's role in the global economy are today. As I often say, U.S.-China relations are at the lowest point that I've seen them in 30 years. I've been a China scholar for about 35 years. And so, I say 30 years because 1994 was the year that the Clinton engagement policy came in place and ushered China into the World Trade Organization. And we've had just deep engagement since then. And then in 2016, things started to go south, and they've gotten more and more tense over the last 8 years. And so it's so important to me that we continue to talk about how to engage and work constructively together and be partners. This morning, I did an interview with China News Service Rex Chen. I've done a couple of interviews with him before, and I love his interviews and love his product. He always produces beautiful videos. And those that will be coming out soon on the China News Service. But I thought I'd just do a recap today of what it is that we talked about, because I thought Rex was asking important questions. So I'm going to dive right in, and feel free to like what we post or ask questions on the YouTube channel post, and I'll look forward to continuing the dialogue with you all. So Rex's first question was, what core competencies should Chinese private enterprise prioritize to navigate Globalization 2.0? How should we design agile organizational structures? So I love this question. I spend a lot of time with my team thinking about why Chinese capitalism is so strong right now. And, we often invoke Andy Walder's 1995 article on local governments as industrial firms. And I'm a student of and a big fan of Neil Flickstein's work on the architecture of markets and the new economic sociology, and his notion of the political culture of coordinated capitalism, in this case with a focus on innovation. And so we write a lot about that, and we write about the industrial clusters that are emerging in China. But this particular question really focuses on private enterprises and the private sector and what's it all mean. So the first thing I think it's important to note, if we think of China as this state-owned economy in the 1980s and 1990s, and if foreign companies wanted to get into China, you sort of had to negotiate with the state and do a joint venture with a state-owned firm and do technology transfer. After China got into the WTO under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, things sort of opened up, and you could no longer have a quid pro quo for market access, but you also just had an explosion of the private sector. And today, China's private firms contribute over 60% of China's GDP, and about 50% or more of foreign trade, and more than 80% of urban unemployment, according to a number of different sources. And so this is a very powerful sector today, right? So if we sort of mistakenly think of, well, China's still a communist economy, so it must be a state-planned economy the way the Soviet Union was and the way China was before its economic opening, that's simply not correct today. Again, some of the things that we've talked about in the early 1980s, we saw the emergence of small-scale private business, household economy, but over the course of the last 3 decades, we've just seen an explosion of the powerful enterprises that are private enterprises and have just become major players in the global political economy. So, if to answer Rex's question, what core competencies should Chinese private enterprises prioritize to navigate Globalization 2.0, and how do we design agile organizational structures? My answer to him was, first, let's focus on one, China's agile, nimble supply chain, the industrial clusters, the competing but collaborating. And here again, I'll invoke Andy Walder, Local Governments and Industrial Firms. And Walder wrote that article in 1995, right? So it was really a foresight of what was coming in China. So again, if we think of communist planned economies as these centrally planned state-owned systems, and maybe that was the case of the Soviet Union under Moscow, but it's not been the case of China for 30 years. China has created this system in which local governments, as Walter put it, are industrial firms, and they're treated as they kind of roll up to Beijing, and they have to sort of think about 5-year plans and things, but they also have to think about being innovative and having coordinated capitalism, and really thinking about how to build powerful industrial clusters that allow them to be a nimble supply chain. And they compete with each other, but they also collaborate. So if you have one city that is focusing on, EV batteries. Another city might focus on some of the components that go into EV batteries, but not be directly competing with the city in their province, right? And so it's a very, very interesting, innovative, collaborative system. I saw this very directly when I was working for Apple in China. I was there from 2014 to 2019. And, I was sort of helping the Apple leadership. I was the head of Apple University in China, so I was doing a lot of leadership development, but I was also working with the supply chain managers and was just helping them negotiate their position. And one of the things that was so smart about Apple, Apple doesn't own any factories in China, but Apple works with about 1,600 Chinese suppliers, and they just sort of send their supply chain managers out. Um, and they help them figure out how to run efficient manufacturing supply chains. And it's a very, very powerful system. But the key is it's not just Apple's doing, it's also those local governments that are inviting Apple in to, when Foxconn was building a factory in Zhengzhou and Apple was collaborating with the Zhengzhou government on how to make the Foxconn Zhengzhou factory incredibly efficient and sophisticated. That was a collaboration and a coordination. And Chinese suppliers are very, very good at this. And so the first thing that I would just say to Chinese suppliers or Chinese private enterprises is capitalize on that. You guys are the best in the world at this right now, right? And there are a couple of players, Apple, Tesla, Walmart, others that do well in China, but you guys can bring this to the world, right? And so that's a really important thing. This is not just knowledge about how to manage labor and how to be efficient in manufacturing supply chains, but go global with this, right? And that brings me to my second point of advice for Chinese private firms. Go global, right? Think about this, right? You worked as since China's economic opening 46 years ago. You've done tremendously well in building the private sector, but the world is waiting for you, right? And we started to see some of this, right? So India, BRICS. We're seeing China, President Xi Jinping and President Modi have sort of softened relations, and the border relationships are going okay. We've seen Foxconn build a huge plant in Chennai. But my guess is that we're going to see a lot more of that kind of activity of building factories global and China, private entrepreneurs and manufacturers bringing their expertise to the world. And we're going to see it with India. We're going to see it with the BRICS economies. Probably going to see it with sub-Saharan Africa, especially given that the United States is making its presence there less felt. The pulling out of USAID money is, I think, a huge mistake, but it's going to create open doors for the need for countries with money, and China's the second largest economy in the world, to invest there and to build factories and to use labor there. And as an aside, sub-Saharan Africa is one of the biggest sources of rare earths, and China is, kind of refines about 90% of the rare earths in the world. And so, it's a big play for China. And so I want to see Chinese entrepreneurs go global. But I also want to see them go global with the US, right? This is a critical time for US-China relations, and things are tense. But the more our economies are economically intertwined, neither of our countries can afford an economic Cold War. But just to be clear, and I've been clear on this in a number of different posts and commentaries, China holds the upper hand here. Yes, we spend a lot of money in companies like Apple and Tesla and Walmart in employing labor in Chinese manufacturers, but a lot of these companies' profitability depends on working with China. When President Trump and Vice President Vance say, well, they should just we'll put tariffs in place and they should just bring their jobs back to the United States, those manufacturing supply chains don't exist in the United States. And so tariffs are just a tax on the American consumer, because it's not like you can raise the prices of goods coming in from China and then have people buy American, because those manufacturing supply chains largely don't exist in America, with a few exceptions. Tesla has a vertically integrated manufacturing supply chain in America, but for the most part, it doesn't exist, right? So we're just taxing consumers. But if the doors were open and we were inviting Chinese suppliers to come invest in places like Phoenix, Arizona. So TSMC over the last 3 years has invested about $65 billion in the Arizona economy in building its fab site manufacturing supply chain. Um, that's big, right? But they need parts from other Chinese manufacturers. And so imagine if Chinese manufacturers in the supply chain were investing in Phoenix, creating jobs, collaborating with TSMC, but also in other industries. We're going to start to see a much better relationship between the United States and China because our economies are going to be so economically integrated. And so I'm a big advocate of that. But going global, don't just focus uh, Chinese entrepreneurs and private enterprises. Don't just focus on India and BRICS and sub-Saharan Africa. Focus on the United States. Go big. Now, that leads me to my third point, collaboration with local governments. We often think of US-China relations as the Beijing-Washington relationship. Forget about that. That is not where action happens. And again, this is where China has led the way. And going back to Walter's local governments as industrial firms, um, this is the local governments are where these things happen, right? And so, it's important to really think about, getting in contact with local governments, right? So Chinese entrepreneurs and private enterprises that are big enough to go global, think about places like Phoenix, Arizona, and the Arizona desert, and then get in contact with Mayor Gallego and think about how to build these relationships and build investment, and then work with the organizations around them, right? So you have Greater Phoenix Leadership that's led by Neil Giuliano, who in the past was the mayor of Tempe. And this is a group of the top 100 corporations in the Arizona or in the Phoenix area. And then there's Global Ties Arizona, and there's the Greater Phoenix Leadership. Well, I already mentioned Greater Phoenix Leadership, but there's also the Greater Phoenix Economic Council, and there's Council on Foreign Phoenix Council on Foreign Relations, and then there's also the Thunderbird School of Global Management and Arizona State University. And so these are all organizations that sort of can help Chinese entrepreneurs and private enterprises figure out how to build and embed themselves in places like the greater Phoenix economy. And so there's just a huge amount of opportunity here. So I would just focus on those key issues, is thinking about, really um, leveraging your knowledge as the leaders of the manufacturing supply chain and the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. Go global. Think about relationships with local governments. And the fourth thing that's so important, brand yourself around this. Find a way to think deeply about branding. I mean, I always think of one of my friends in China. I haven't talked to her in several years, but when I was with Apple, I got to know Zhou Qinfei pretty well. And, she's an amazing entrepreneur, right? And I mean, think about Lens Technology. I mean, she's now the richest woman in China, in part because of her work with Apple, but also because she's been brilliant at building her enterprise as a brand around global thinking and around innovative thinking. And so think about how to bring these ideas to places like Phoenix, brand yourself around it, and work with people at Thunderbird, at ASU, and build your presence in different places. Okay, so that's my answer to Rex's first question. Second question. Amid the supply chain restructuring and geopolitical uncertainties, how should Chinese entrepreneurs recalibrate their global strategies? So this, I already answered part of this, but let me just say again, engagement, engagement, engagement. Engagement, trade, and collaboration are central to safe collaborative geopolitical dynamics, right? So yes, we're in a tense time and there's a lot of uncertainty, but our two economies, the two largest economies in the world, the United States and China, are fundamentally married. We're interdependent. If things got tough and suddenly Tesla and Apple and Walmart started having a difficult time in China, it's a disaster for the US economy, right? It's a disaster for both our economies. And so, yes, there are geopolitical uncertainties, but getting to the negotiating table and building ties is important. Now, again, we can look to our leaders and say, like, well, that's Xi Jinping and President Trump, like that's what it should. No, this is about building engagement in the local political economies. And so the same way that Apple is so deeply embedded in China, and Tim Cook took Apple into China in 2001, and I didn't start working for them until 2014. But, it was so clear that we were in such a deep marriage to China. And when things got a little bit tense in 2014, 2015, it was very clear that we had to show that we were partners. And so I would love to see Chinese entrepreneurs do the same. Like show up and show your partners. And I'm biased towards the situation in the American economy and especially the situation in the Phoenix economy. But you have opportunities all around the world, right? You have opportunities with the BRICS economies, you have opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa, but also with Europe, right? I was just in an interview last week with several European journalists who had come to Arizona and they came to Thunderbird to talk to me about these issues. And they were just sort of like, what do we do? How do we think about this? And we got into these conversations about similar to what I'm saying to Chinese private enterprises and entrepreneurs right now. Same thing should be said to European entrepreneurs and European government officials. And so we need to build these relationships. So just worry less about the uncertainties and take a proactive approach to building embedded partnerships. So I always teach the executives that I'm working with who are investing in China. First phrase I always teach them is in Chinese is 合作伙伴, cooperation and collaboration. Cooperation and collaboration. This is the most important thing. And if we do that, things are going to get better. And again, just like I said at the end of the first question, brand yourself around this, right? For Chinese entrepreneurs, build your brand around being a 合作伙伴 company, somebody coming to Phoenix and we're going to work together and we're going to teach each other. Okay. So Rex's third question was, as Chinese enterprises face heightened complexity and globalization, how can cross-cultural leadership be developed? Okay, this is a great question, and it's very near and dear to the hearts of my own teaching in executive education, but also the hearts of many of my colleagues at places like the Thunderbird School of Global Management. And also, I work with Marshall Goldsmith's 100 Coaches, and we like to think about how to coach executives on how to handle themselves well in the global economy. So, cross cultural management is key. Embrace this. Use educational providers like Thunderbird and coaching providers like Marshall Goldsmith's 100 Coaches, and be open to it, right? I mean, this is, we've seen some of these tensions with TSMC. They're already in the process of building these three fab sites. They've invested $65 billion. They've gotten $6.5 billion from the US government. They're here and they've had trouble. They've struggled because they haven't really sort of been attuned to just how different management practices are in places like Taiwan and Phoenix. And so, and the same is going to be true for Chinese entrepreneurs that come global and invest in the United States and invest in Europe. And so we do need to think about cross-cultural management, right? And so, there are lots of providers out here and there are lots of like thought leaders who think about these issues. I have many colleagues at Thunderbird who think about these issues and I love to teach about them. I love to teach about them myself, but embrace it and really push your leaders to think openly about it, right? Because this is again part of 合作伙伴 and cross-cultural relations are a key to it. Okay. And the fourth issue is with ESG emerging as a global business imperative, how can Chinese firms turn compliance challenges into innovation opportunities? What replicable pathways exist? So again, this is a great question, and I think it's often the case, and it's a mistake that many companies, not just Chinese companies, but many companies around the world, in the United States and many places, think about ESG and these kinds of compliance issues as just, these are a burden for doing business, and we have to comply with all of these strange environmental and social and governance responsibility laws. And what I would say here is, yeah, these change the dynamics, and you have to comply. But the companies that are going to win are those that think innovatively around these issues, right? And so first we have to do it, embrace it, but embrace the idea of innovation around the issue, right? So think about how we can just be on the cutting edge of how to think about ESG. And again, I would raise, people like Zhou Chunfei or Grace Wong at Luxshare ICT and many of the other suppliers we worked with in China when I was at Apple. Um, there are companies that think deeply about this, and so there's a lot of innovation going on right now. And those who take the lead in this approach and who are really kind of thinking innovatively about it are the ones that are going to be okay. And not only are going to be okay, you're going to win because you'll be in good with the government compliance issues around ESG, but you'll also be viewed as a market leader. And so I would just say, yeah, ESG is there. A lot of compliance issues are there and everywhere. We got to embrace it. We got to deal with it. We got to not try to get around it, but also work with local governments and local organizations on what the innovative cutting edge ideas are for how to deal with it. So those are the four questions that I had from Rex Chen this morning, and I really enjoyed the interview, and I'm happy to share some of my ideas with our OGL audience here as well. So thank you all, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue with everyone here. All right, talk to you soon.